Okay, yeah, I've had some serious technical difficulties recording and the stuff, and it's so frustrating to me because I know what I want to happen, and then it doesn't happen. Anyway, you didn't come here for any of that. I thought I would respond to the comments on my previous questions comments video. Is God simple? No, wait. Does God require fine tuning? It caused quite the reaction, which is great for me. Any reaction is a good reaction, right? So I thought I would just interact more with what you had to say. Okay, first comment. The difference between humans and God is, as I said in the comment, we already know humans exist. Even alien civilizations are presumed to originate from similar processes that create humans. So in both the case of humans and aliens, we have some a priori evidence of their existence. God is a completely different kind of entity, and we have no a priori evidence of his existence, as we can't refer to ordinary experience. So I guess right off the bat, I don't agree with that because I think you're using a priori in a non-standard sense, in a non-standard way. To have a priori evidence of aliens would be to have like conceptual evidence for their existence, like thought experiments, philosophical means of discovering truth, not empirical evidence, because empirical evidence is a posteriori, like after experience or something like that. Whereas a priori is how you would know that 2 + 2 = 4. Like you don't need to go out into the world and investigate in order to know that 2 + 2 = 4. So you can't have a priori evidence of aliens, I don't think. So what I think you mean is that we have some, however weak, independent empirical evidence for aliens that we just don't have for God's existence. But I don't see why I would grant that an alien civilization would have, say, a non-negligible prior probability, but God's existence would, on the basis of empirical evidence. I mean, both are not directly experienced by us. They're reconstructions based on the evidence we have. So why should God be different than a hypothetical alien civilization? When objectors say that God would not be just as fine-tuned, an objection espoused by very smart people like David, whatever his last name is, as well, so would hardly call it silly. Fair, fine. They don't mean it in the same sense that the universe is. Okay, good. The objection is more so what's more improbable, the universe being fine-tuned by chance or God's very existence. Right, okay. And given God's attributes and high levels of specified complexity, one might even argue that a God is more improbable than that. So there, I think that's the right question to ask. And so I get the point. Is God's existence more improbable than fine-tunings occurring by chance? Because if it is, then we should just say that fine-tuning was a brute fact. We shouldn't posit something that's even more improbable than the brute fact of fine-tuning. I'll give you that. But why think that? Why think that God's existence is more improbable than fine-tunings occurring by chance alone? So we grant in this dialectical context that for the sake of argument, the probability of that happening, fine-tuning of the universe, happening by chance is something like 1 part in 10 to the 136th power. That's physicist Luke Barnes' estimate. Well, why think that theism's prior probability, that is to say, the probability of theism independently of fine-tuning, before we've discovered that evidence, just what we think the probability is, why think that it's smaller than 1 part in 10 to the 136th? You mentioned specified complexity, but that's a very non-standard analysis of probability and design inference. It stems from William Dembski. The vast majority of philosophers and scientists who've thought about these things reject that analysis. So what is it about God's existence that's so improbable? That he has specific attributes? I guess that one way of cashing out the argument is to say that there are more ways to not be an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good being than there are to be that being. Because, so for instance, that hypothesis attributes infinite power and infinite knowledge and infinite goodness to God. And so in order to be God, you have to have that exact amount. Whereas for the world to be such that God doesn't exist, there could be an array of beings falling at all levels less than infinity for power, goodness, and knowledge, and that would qualify as a non-theistic world. So there are more ways for reality to be non-theistic than there are to be theistic. Sure. So that's an argument. But Richard Swinburne makes the point that, or argues anyway, that we shouldn't apply like a uniform probability distribution in that way, because infinite quantities of attributes, infinite degrees of attributes are actually simpler than any arbitrary finite degree, and therefore more intrinsically probable. I don't really know about that argument, but there's something to be said for it. There's some plausibility to an idea that an infinite amount versus 767 are different in terms of their intrinsic likelihood. But I think that I believe the philosopher's name is Callum Scott, who recently wrote a paper about whether or not God is a simple hypothesis. And he argues anyway that our approach to inductive reasoning in science, or inductive generalizations, suggests that universal generalizations are far, far more intrinsically probable than any less than universal generalization. So for instance, the thesis that all protons have charge +1. That's a universal generalization. All protons have +1 charge, is more intrinsically probable than any other hypothesis, like all protons except for 2, all protons except for 3, all protons except for 4. And why do I think that? Well, because if we don't think that, then there's no way to infer the truth of a universal generalization based on our empirical experience. Obviously, we haven't surveyed every single proton. How do we know that they all have charge +1? The only way that that inference can stand is if the universal generalization has a much higher prior probability than the whole conjunction of alternatives, all protons +1, or all protons +3, or all protons except for 5, so on and so forth. Now, that's an interesting argument. And then the point will be that by analogy, the hypothesis that God has all power and all knowledge and all goodness has a much higher prior probability than all of the subsidiary hypotheses of the negation of theism. So, God has degree. So a being has power degree n, knowledge degree n, goodness degree n, and then n+1, n+2. All of those hypotheses, the entire conjunction of them, must therefore have a lower prior probability than theism. Now, I don't know about that argument. I'm still thinking about it. It's interesting, and so the point would be that the scientific facts we take ourselves to know require that universal generalizations must have a much, much higher prior probability than the entire conjunction of non-universal generalizations. So if that's the case, then you could argue theism, therefore, must have a higher prior probability than any of these alternatives, and therefore this complexity argument doesn't go through. Sure, God is not a physical being, but one can imagine infinitely many types of beings or alternative forms of reality without God. After all, we are doing the same with the fine-tuning of the universe. Right. So that would be my point, my argument. And you couldn't say the same thing about fine-tuning because there's no universal generalization involved in the hypothesis of naturalism, right? So you couldn't make the same claim about the prior probability of naturalism. If I could maybe reframe the argument, theists will point out that the intrinsic probability of the cosmological constants being simply a brute fact that requires no further explanation is extremely low. That is why they tell us that the universe needs a fine-tuner. However, I think the problem also occurs with the God hypothesis. Theists are claiming that there's this being with a desire to set the cosmological constants to what they are. On top of that, this being has the power to do whatever it desires. However, wouldn't this desire also have an extremely low intrinsic probability? Therefore, wouldn't this desire also require an explanation? I'm aware that there are some theists that try to explain the creation of the universe from God's divinely simple attributes. I wouldn't do that, so blah, 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 blah. Okay, we'll get on to the second part of that in a second. Right, so there are actually two ways that you might spell out this complexity objection. You might say that the prior probability of God's existence is just as low or lower than fine-tunings occurring by chance. And that seemed to be what the previous commenter was saying. Or you could make the claim that's being made now, not that God's existence maybe is intrinsically all that improbable. Rather, what's improbable is God's wanting to create a fine-tuned universe. So that is to say, the idea here would be that, sure, the likelihood of fine-tuning obtaining given naturalism is extremely low. But the likelihood of fine-tuning obtaining even given theism is equally low. Why would God want to create a fine-tuned universe when he has infinitely more options in addition to a fine-tuned universe? And I think that's a better rendition of the argument, but I think it still doesn't succeed because, for one thing, you're comparing theism and naturalism with certain items of information fixed in the background. So you say, given all of these things, what do we expect to observe under theism and under naturalism? And so you take the laws of nature as given. You even take the psychophysical laws, as I argue in a publication, the laws that dictate what kinds of structures support consciousness and which do not. You take those all in the background. You say, given these laws of nature, given these psychophysical laws of this subset of reality, of possible reality, what then do we expect to observe within that subset if theism is true and if naturalism is true? And here, you wouldn't just apply a uniform probability distribution to all of God's options. Rather, because God is perfectly good, we can prioritize or attribute a higher likelihood to those ends or aims that are morally good. And the better the aim is, the more likely it is that a perfectly good being would take that aim. And then the argument will be that conscious life is a great good, and therefore it's not highly improbable that God would take that option, would create life like that. I think this objection works against kind of a mere theistic or minimal theistic hypothesis where you don't include information about the designer's moral attributes, because then you're right. There would be the likelihood of a fine-tuned universe obtaining given just a generic designer would be just as low as given naturalism. But that's not typically how the fine-tuning argument is framed. It's framed around theism. So there you go. That's in a nutshell what I think. What else here? Okay, however, the best I have seen is that an all-loving God would want to create life in general. However, that doesn't explain the reason for the specific constants we see. I can imagine a variety of different universes teeming with life, so in exchange for increasing the intrinsic probability of the theory, I think they greatly lowered the theoretical probability of the constants being what they are. Oh, wait, that confused me. I think they greatly lowered the theory. Right. God would have chosen to make the universe however he wanted. Okay, so here the issue is that argument about the value of life and therefore God is likely to create life, that doesn't provide an explanation for the specific values of the constants. But I think that my point about what is taken as background information, what is taken as given, is the answer to that objection. Once the laws of nature and the psychophysical laws are in place, exist and taken for granted, and taken as given, well then, what other options does God have to bring about life except to fine-tune nature's constants? We just, again, we take them as background information. And as for why we can do that, like why can we just carve up our evidence base as some of it as background information and some of it as the evidence to be explained? Well, we can do that in this case, on my understanding, according to my analysis anyway, because the laws of nature, for instance, are no more likely given theism than given naturalism. And so any improbability that theism attributes to the laws of nature themselves, the mathematical form of the laws, just cancels out because they are equally as improbable given naturalism. So when you're comparing naturalism and theism, the improbability or the probability of the laws of nature themselves can be placed in as background information because it can't adjudicate between the two hypotheses. That's a rough and ready explanation. We can give a fuller answer at some other point. So I don't think you're missing anything. I just think that once we appreciate the structure of the fine-tuning argument, what's taken as background, so as to narrow the scope of possibilities down to a manageable domain, and then we ask within this domain, what kind of reality would we expect God to create? What kind of reality would we expect given naturalism? And when you do that, I think it's clear that fine-tuning has a much, much higher likelihood on theism than naturalism. Please have a conversation with David, that guy who refutes Bayesian epistemology completely. Okay. Here is a similar objection. The appeal to a designer is fine-tuned in this sense, that the designer intended this exact universe when creating, when there are many possible alternatives open to the designer. Note that your appeal to human designer explanations doesn't work here, as we have all sorts of background knowledge that narrows down the possibilities for what we think human designers would do. We could make the designer hypothesis less specific, but then we lose our ability of making the design hypothesis predict this universe, or a universe sufficiently similar. And it would open many more possibilities that would make it even with naturalism relative to predictiveness. Right. So this does seem like Graham Oppy's points, as the objector points out. I think we can narrow down we can narrow down the range of possibilities here by, again, fixing certain things as background information. To give an analogy, imagine that you are in a court of law and you're a prosecuting attorney, and the defendant is on trial for murder. And you present your case. There's a fingerprint on the gun that matches the defendant, the murder weapon. And it matches the defendant's fingerprint. Well, that's pretty damning evidence, right? Well, no. Imagine the defense attorney standing up and saying, actually, all you've shown is that a fingerprint at some location or other on the gun is more likely if my defendant is guilty than if he's innocent. But you haven't shown that a fingerprint in the exact location in which it was found, say on the left-hand side of the barrel, is more likely given his guilt than his innocence. And because you haven't shown that, you've only established this more general fact, therefore the evidence is insignificant or fails to show that my client is guilty. Well, why is that a stupid response that you haven't shown the exact location that the fingerprint was found on as more likely on the guilt hypothesis than the innocence one? Well, because the exact location on the gun is equally improbable on any relevant hypothesis. So for instance, we have the guilty hypothesis, the defendant committed the murder, and then say we have the hypothesis that the victim committed suicide. Neither explanation leads you to think that any particular location on the gun is more likely than any other to have a fingerprint on it. And so any improbability involved of that the hypothesis might attribute to that exact location versus any other, it just cancels out because neither hypothesis has an explanatory edge. So why was I saying all of that? Oh, when we approach the fine-tuning of the universe, that's another way of articulating the point that certain things can be taken as background information. The laws of nature, our psychophysical laws, and so on. Again, however pertinent this concern might be to a generic designer hypothesis, as you indicate, most of the time we're concerned with theism as the explanation. And so there is predictive power given that the designer is perfectly good. And if I'm right about the arguments for thinking that a God of all power, all knowledge, all goodness has a higher prior probability than arbitrary finite alternatives, even the whole conjunction of alternatives, then we can see a way of addressing this objection. Obviously, more needs to be said, but that's where my thoughts are going of late. One more thing. Humans and presumably aliens, if they exist, would both be created from simpler evolutionary processes, as Dawkins points out. God doesn't have a creator. So it seems more untenable to believe in immense complexity without simpler origins. Well, I think that the same kind of considerations that you advance for thinking that God's existence is improbable is extremely improbable because there's just infinitely more or other ways that reality could have been that are non-theistic. That same kind of consideration would suggest that evolutionary theory is extremely complex. I mean, just imagine the infinite range of possible ways reality could have been that were non-evolutionary, other ways that things could have come into being, other processes, natural and supernatural ones. Well, then that would seem to mean that actually evolution, although showing how simple organisms can generate complexity over time, the process itself, the hypothesis itself, is extremely complex and more improbable than anything is called upon to explain. So I wouldn't actually grant to Dawkins his point here. But what that suggests is not that we are illegitimate in inferring evolutionary explanations for the origin of life. It means there's something wrong with that theoretical point. There's something wrong with the argument being made here about probabilities. But more thought needed on that. The argument is not that it's a bad explanation because God has to be fine-tuned. The argument is that you have an intolerable regress by parity of reasoning, or at some point you have to look at other virtues, because if you accept that the universe appears finely tuned, which I don't know why anyone would accept it at all, it certainly doesn't appear that way to me. Why wouldn't that just be the terminal case? It's a dilemma. Either infinite regress of designers or appearance of fine-tuning is insufficient to warrant the inference. Only if we grant that God would be fine-tuned as well, which I don't think is the case. While it is legitimate to apply a uniform probability distribution to all possible values of the constants, it is not similarly justified to apply a uniform probability distribution to all of the degrees that God's attributes might have, all of the finite degrees and then the infinite degree that would be omnipotence and omniscience and moral perfection. Because, as I say, those attributes seem to resemble a universal generalization, which, if we think about scientific facts, suggests that universal generalizations have a much, much higher prior probability than these arbitrary finite versions or claims. So That, I think, would be my response, is that we don't get an infinite regress in the case of appealing to God, because there's no similar fine-tuning or improbability that would then warrant a further inference. Unless this argument that Callum makes, I got to check to make sure his name is Callum, unless that argument fails. Okay, last one. Part of the fine-tuning argument insists that because the natural world is so fine-tuned, the only option is a creator for that fine-tuning. So if you accept that God can be fine-tuned, then you are undermining the fine-tuning argument, because you are admitting that the fine-tuning does not necessitate a creator for that fine-tuning. As for asserting that God is simple, you also undermine the fine-tuning argument, because you are admitting that simple things can create more complex things, and therefore fine-tuning doesn't necessitate a designer. So I don't agree with that. The two explanations for fine-tuning, generally speaking, are theism and naturalism. Those are the two explanations on the table. And merely granting the point that an explanation can be simpler than the thing it is called upon to explain doesn't do anything to show that naturalism can explain fine-tuning better than theism. Because you've already admitted, in this dialectical context anyway, that the likelihood of fine-tuning occurring given naturalism is absurdly small. And that's what the brute fact appeal is, that we just take it as a brute fact because that's the only way naturalism could explain fine-tuning. It just happened. And then the theist would say that theism attributes a much higher likelihood to it, and therefore the fine-tuning is strong evidence for theism. And as long as theism's prior probability isn't ridiculously small, then the fine-tuning evidence will lead to an appreciable bump in our estimation of theism's probability. Maybe we came to the fine-tuning debate thinking that God's existence had a 10% chance of being true, that theism had a 10% chance of being true. Well, then you observe fine-tuning and you say, wow, fine-tuning is much, much, much more likely given theism than given naturalism. And therefore, when I work out all the math, it seems to me that the final likelihood or the final probability of theism is 90%. And similarly, the probability of naturalism would decrease in the face of fine-tuning evidence. So nothing about that chain of reasoning is illicit, given the claim that simple explanations can explain complex facts. The naturalist, if they wanted to compete with theism, would have to give a better explanation than the appeal to brute facts, or to give some reason for thinking that naturalism has a much, much, much higher prior probability than theism. So I'll have to think about these things more, because things get complicated quickly. But that is where my thoughts are going of late. And I'm actually reading several papers on this problem exactly, about theism, simplicity, complexity, prior probability, in relationship to related objections to the fine-tuning argument. I'm working on a paper called Fine-Tuning and the Gap Problem. Namely, how do you connect the conclusion of most fine-tuning arguments that there is a designer? How do you connect that conclusion to, therefore, God exists? How do you bridge that gap? Because even if there's a designer of the universe, how do you show that that designer is God, morally perfect, all-powerful, all-knowing? That's the paper I'm working on. And you then get into issues of theism's prior probability and so on. So this is good. This is really good. I think I'm going to, once those papers tie up, if I haven't already addressed this issue, I think I'm going to begin work on a paper about God, fine-tuning, and simplicity, and whether or not the God hypothesis is simple. Because this is quite interesting. It's not as easy to dismiss this objection as I thought. So thank you. If I write this paper, you will get a thank you in the acknowledgments on it, the YouTube, little YouTube community we got here. So have a great day. Bye-bye.